Welcome to this talk organized by Domus Academy. We have the pleasure to host Usman Haque today. My name is Michele Aquila. I'm the program leader of the Master in Interaction Design and the Master in Service Design of Domus Academy. In our school, we already invited Usman for a lecture a few months ago. It was incredibly successful and enriching for our students. So it was with great pleasure we are inviting again Usman. Also because we think that the topic and the themes he works on are perfect with the theme of the Milano Digital Week, which is about equitable and sustainable cities. As you will see in the talk, Usman, who's the creative director and founding partner of Umbrellium, design and builds urban technologies that support citizens' empowerment and high impact engagement in cities. So Usman works with urban experiences, we may say. Usman is also founding partner of Thinkful, which is a search engine for the Internet of Things. So you will discover in a bit the projects and the researches done by Usman, who's with us from the other side of the world, from Singapore. Hello, Usman. Ciao.
Hello.
Hello.
Good to see you. How are you doing?
We are fine, thank you. Are you in Singapore, right?
I am in Singapore. I'm here temporarily. I should be finally back to London in about 2 weeks. I've been here now 6 months, but hoping to get home in 2 weeks.
Okay, thank you for being with us. It's a great pleasure always to have you. I would like to welcome also all the audience and the people who are attending. Very glad to have very good number of attendees, and I would like to also thank you, the students who are now connected together with me and Usman as panelists, because they will join the session after Usman's presentation in a Q&A session. So they will share their thoughts and questions with Usman. So I would say that we have first a presentation by Usman about his works, and then we move on into this Q&A by done with the students from Domus Academy. Thank you, Usman. Again, feel free to start whenever you want. I will be here. Thank you again for all the audience for being with us.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Thanks for that introduction. I would like to just share my screen here. Let me start. Here we go. So I want to talk today about infrastructures for participation. The topic is something that has been kind of key to my work over the last 10 or 15 years, which is really how to get people involved in the design and creation of their own environments, their neighborhoods, their cities, and so on and so forth. I'm trained as an architect, and so today I'm going to be presenting a particular perspective on architecture, on technology, on cities, and more specifically on participation, and what I call the infrastructures of participation. I'm going to get a little deeper into that later, but essentially when I'm talking about the infrastructures of participation, I'm talking about all the different ways that we can structure the way that people are able to collaborate with each other to do something or to achieve something. Now, there's actually been quite a lot of work done on what are known as the structures of participation. The reason I talk about the infrastructures is because I'm actually interested almost at a level below the structures, which is how to create the platforms that enable a variety of structures, if you like, of participation. And I use this analogy partly because I think of my background in architecture, but also because I think that even in, I think the one of the really interesting things that you understand through the discipline of architecture, that even something that seems to have no structure actually is itself a form of structure. And so whenever you're talking about participatory systems, the question of things like the dynamics of power, the dynamics of governance and decision-making all become very important. I'm actually going to just start with an image that kind of got me started in this kind of work about 26 years ago was when I first saw this image, which was from a book called The Climatic Physiology of the Pig. Now, these are the same piglets in the same box, but on the right-hand side, the temperature has been increased by just a few degrees. And what was so interesting about this image was that from an architectural perspective, it really expressed how just by a small change in the software of space or the program of space, changing the temperature, you can dramatically alter the experience that the occupants have within that space, the experience to each other, to the environment around them, and so on and so forth. And it kind of led me to start thinking about architecture, not just as walls and roof and ceiling and floor and so on and so forth, but also temperature and sound and lights and electromagnetic fields and even sort of social relationships. And more specifically, it kind of got me thinking from the perspective of architecture, there are sort of three fundamental aspects that I think that even now I still continue to sort of approach architecture. The first is this idea that for me, that in architecture, it is not architecture until there is a process of perception and interaction. The actual, the difference between the physical structure and the experience is, if you like, manifested by some kind of embodiment in the experience of space and in the experience of people to each other. And without that, you know, architecture really is just static sculpture. Buildings in and of themselves, to me, are not exactly architecture. The second thing about architecture that kind of really drove home to me was this idea that we should, or rather I wanted to focus on building for now and the near-term future. And this is because I think there is, of course, a branch of architecture that is all about speculation and it is about the future. But I'm most interested myself in how do we do everything that's incredibly complex right now so that we can collectively figure out that future. I think one of the sort of challenges in the architecture profession that we are confronted with in the 21st century is that historically, typically, the architect has had to own and control the vision of the future. And that has not worked. You know, we have to find a new paradigm for imagining, deciding on, and then creating the future. And for me, anyway, it has to be built on what we are doing right now. The third thing is this idea that technology is not in any sense neutral. It is a sort of a socio-political framework, and architecture is a socio-political framework made solid, if you like. Now, again, there's a lot of work and other people that you can dive into to look more closely at this relationship between technology and society. But essentially, what it meant for me was that whenever I'm working with technology, I am trying to remember that there is a political process that I'm going through. And by political, I ultimately mean power, right? Because the discipline of architecture has historically been very much about this question of who has power, who is deciding, who is defining, who is actually determining what a city looks like, what a building looks like, how people occupy the buildings, what they're allowed to do there, where they're allowed to do it, when they're allowed to do it. And historically, the power dynamic has been, in the architecture profession, it has been male dominated, and it has been dominated by the individual kind of making that set of decisions on behalf of others. What we are seeing now, however, is that there is a vision of power in the city that can be much more dispersed, that can be much more about a diversity of sometimes even conflicting ideas of power and what it's used for. And what I find quite interesting is that this is a challenge that actually faces designers in general, because particularly if you're interested in participatory systems, as I am, you're ultimately grappling with this question of how do I remove the power that I have as a designer and distribute it more evenly, or how can I actually be part of a system where actually I have almost a desire to reduce power. And there's a variety of ways that I think we can do that, which I'll come to in a bit. Now, often this kind of conjunction of technology and cities and technology and power and people ends up kind of in a debate about the smart city and kind of using technology to create the, as this marketing slide shows, the building tomorrow's cities. The issue is, and I think this is has been quite well debated recently, is that of course cities are not problems to be solved, but technology is sold as a solution to a problem. And when technology is applied to a city as if it were a problem, actually it's like taking a hammer to a multidimensional game of chess. You know, the city is such a complex organism that a blunt instrument like technology, in the absence of much more sophisticated implementation of things like participation and governance, is pretty much doomed to fail. And also, if you look at the kind of paradigm of the smart city as it kind of manifests itself in terms of the surveillance and security mechanisms, this is also what the smart city is about, right? It's about dynamics of power and control. It's about data, personal data that's actually accessible by other organisms, organizations unknown to you. It's about leaking data. All of this is the smart city. It's car companies faking their environmental data. It's about autonomous vehicle testing on the streets before actually finishing a product. It's about, you know, a teenager being able to hack into systems and take them over. All of this is as much a part of the smart city paradigm as the marketing spiel about sort of making happier, healthier cities and so on and so forth. So this is actually a video from a demonstration. It's a few years old now, but it's a demonstration of a self-driving vehicle that's supposed to be demonstrating how it parks. And what's interesting is just watch the people who are watching this demonstration. So they trusted the algorithms inside this car so explicitly that they didn't even jump out of the way when the car accelerated towards them. And it was later explained that the reason that this accident happened was because a certain module had not been activated in the car. This is as much a part of the smart city as the dream. And one of the problems with this kind of approach, a technology-driven approach to trying to solve the city, is that we've actually seen this happen time and time again. So this is an image of Pruitt-Igoe in the 1960s. This was a new urban development near the west side of the US. And when it was presented, it was marketed along the lines of being a safe and secure and convenient and optimized environment, using exactly the same language that's being used today to sell technology systems for the city. And barely 10 years later, that development was knocked down because it was a bit of a disaster. And although some people think it was the fault of the physical structures, the buildings, in actual fact, it was a failure across everything from the diversity of perspectives of all the different people that had to move into this development, whose views were not taken into account. It was a failure of governance, it was a failure of social programs, and it was a failure of all the things that are actually important when designing and making decisions about urban environments. And so it's because of this that whenever I'm talking about the kind of technological project that I tend to get involved in, the participatory framework is actually the more important aspect of it, if you see what I mean. Actually figuring out how to involve people in a process is not just something that's kind of nice and cute to have. It's actually in order to fundamentally drive the project itself and ensure that it doesn't fail. So if I'm going to talk about the infrastructures of participation, there's really three key things that I think I've picked up over the years that, at least for me, have kind of driven the way I've tried to kind of determine these kind of infrastructures, if you like. The most basic one is when I'm working on a project, I'm trying to think about how can I increase the number of decisions that other people make. In other words, rather than being the kind of the controller of all decisions at this kind of center of a project, which is typically the role of a creative director, actually, how can you involve more and more people in more and more decisions? And the reason I say number of decisions is that actually what I've noticed over the years is that even if the decisions are small, even if the decisions seem trivial, that somebody else is making, that a member of a local neighborhood or local community is making, even if they seem like sort of small or trivial decisions, actually by having more of a say at more opportunities and having more opportunities to kind of present their perspective, it means that they're more invested in the process of the project itself. And this is something I'd like to contrast to the way that typically an architect getting involved in community-led design might work, where they will do a design and then they will ask the community for feedback, and you'll sit down around a table and people kind of offer their opinions and so on and so forth. But all they're really doing is feeding back on a design that already exists. So they have one, they basically have one big decision, but in order to satisfy all of their criteria, you end up having to chop down the scope and ambition of that project. And what I'm suggesting instead is actually that if you involve people throughout the entire process, deciding on small parts of it, actually by the time you all sit down, everyone has kind of already been able to see where their particular input came into a project, rather than just having to decide at the end. The second thing is this idea of ensuring that you're through the process of participating, building a shared memory of a possible future. So as a designer, rather than determining the outcome and then trying to convince people to join it, instead flipping it so that you're designing a platform or a framework or even just a situation or an event where people can come together to make their own decisions together about what the future might look like, or what that or to experience something together in order to critique whether it is what one needs for the future. So it's about their experience of the sort of the near future. The third thing is, and this is the final one, is figuring out ways to connect people together so that they're doing stuff together, they're making decisions together that in some way exceed their expectations for what they would have otherwise done on their own. And essentially what this means is that when people are working together and accomplishing something together, what I've noticed is it leads more often to people feeling responsible for the outcome. You know, they're actually, if you like, collectively part of determining something, and through their connections with other people, they're able to have more of an impact than they would have had on their own. So I'm often trying to think about how to really just connect people together so that they can do stuff. For example, making decisions together about something. So what I want to do is I just want to go through these three things, and in each case, illustrate a project to kind of discuss what this means. So the first one is increase the number of decisions. So I'm going to talk about a project called Cinder, which is situated in Cambridge in the United Kingdom. It's actually on the outskirts of the city of Cambridge. We were invited to come and work with what would be a new community, a new urban development. And there was going to be a new school called Trumpington Community College. And we were asked to work to do a project for the school. And in fact, there wasn't really much of a brief when we first got involved, but we were told that the school was going to be filled with high-tech and high sustainability systems, lots of sensors, energy monitoring, and so on and so forth. And we were also told that there would be, that the challenge for us really was to make the incoming students feel like the building, the school itself was theirs, you know, because they were a new community, to feel like that school was actually their resource, their building, their kind of community space, if you like. And this building was planned to have quite an innovative classroom setup, and to be essentially very much focused on things like science and technology and so on and so forth. So we worked with the students that would be coming into the school for about 2 years before the building was even open. So we worked in different schools around the around Cambridge from the Federation that would be ultimately moving into the school when it was open. And for 2 years, we did a series of workshops with them, trying to understand, you know, what would make this school feel like theirs. And one of the themes that emerged quite early on was the idea of having a school pet or a school mascot. And so the students would each kind of discuss what this pet or mascot might look like, what it might do, how it might behave. And they would present to each other and to us, and we'd discuss and debate how it might manifest itself in the school. As I said, this kind of went on for a couple of years, doing these kind of workshops. What soon emerged was the idea that a cat would be a good pet to have. we started building kind of prototypes of a kind of an interactive cat that could roam around the school with all sorts of behaviors. Basically, they were interested to have it connected to the sensor systems and responding to the environment and to the energy use and changing its behavior and color and size and all these sorts of things. And so we did a series of prototypes in response to that work that effectively a couple of years later turned into an augmented reality interface in the school, where this cat prowls around, interacting with people, but also responding to the environment, getting bigger, changing color, disappearing, playing with people. And the students can kind of read the environment of the building through the cat. But every now and then the cat disappears into the network, gets bored or hungry, and appears on one student's laptop. And the student whose laptop it appears on has to decide how much to feed Cinder. And the amount of food that's available is based on how much energy has been generated by the solar panels. So they're having to make a decision about the resource allocation on the basis of their understanding of the environment, of the energy usage of the building itself. And Cinder is a cat that they themselves that have actually created to manifest their experience of the building. And so this was done as a permanent part of the building fabric. The data model is designed actually to last at least 20 years as technology evolves. New types of visualization can use it. But essentially, it's, if you like, it's almost like a replacement for what is typically a building management system with a bar graph. And here it's the building actually exemplifying people's experience with the environment. And it's designed according to some of the things that the students planned to actually evolve over time. And there are lots of sort of Easter eggs that are built into it, so that 5 years from now, certain things are going to happen that the students who were there at the time will probably be off to university by that point. And Cinder's actually going to do some very different things at that point. So that was all about getting people involved in kind of decision making and being involved throughout the process of kind of really sort of defining what the outcome would be. Next, I want to show a project which illustrates this idea of building a shared memory of a possible future. So we had been thinking about for a while the challenge of pedestrian crossings in the 21st century. And they're a challenge because the pedestrian crossing that we're used to, at least in Britain, was originally designed about 50 or 60 years ago. And as our streets start to get filled up with autonomous vehicles, which is what the self-driving car companies tell us, eventually you will no longer need to have a crossing, because you'll be able to cross anywhere, and somehow sort of automatically the vehicles will be able to move around you. Now that's fine, but we're assuming it works. It's still going to be at least another 20 years before that is the case. And in fact, the next 20 years are therefore the most complex, because people in the 21st century really respond to a crossing in a very different way than they might have 50 or 60 years ago. Not just because their relationship to the street has changed, but even where they were painted may no longer be fit for their needs. And so we started working on this idea and we worked in South London on this, the idea of a pedestrian crossing where actually it would learn what is the best possible configuration at any given time of day, and be able to kind of evolve over time to respond to the way that people use that crossing. So in other words, rather than designing the crossing to be kind of all about the vehicles, it was about designing a crossing that was all about people and how they use the space and how to make the road more dynamic for people to use it themselves. And so, as I said, I think at the beginning of this talk, for me, it's important to actually build and not just speculate on what this might be for people who are actually potentially going to be use it. So we created this in South London. We actually built this street, which is fully dynamic. We created a road surface that has that is essentially, it's a bit like a sort of a computer screen, but it's it can take the weight of vehicles. It's waterproof, and you can see it during the day. And we coupled it with a camera vision system that actually can make sense of what is going on in the street. In other words, the vehicles, the cyclists, the pedestrians, how many there are, where they're crossing, when there are danger conditions, and essentially create different types of pattern or output in order to kind of adapt to the situation. So for example, if there's a lot more people crossing, for example, when school is finished for the day and lots of kids are trying to walk across the road, the crossing could actually get wider, and it could move from one end of the street to the other, perhaps on the weekend when different people are using the space, or if somebody runs in front of a vehicle, the road could actually show some sort of warning signals for people. So once we did that, that was about 4 years ago. We ended up about 9 months, no, actually about a year ago now, spinning out a separate company called Starling, which is all focused on basically developing pedestrian safety systems in junctions and streets. And it's more about the kind of the control mechanism than the output, because now there's actually a lot of output systems on roads. You know, there's all sorts of LED technology that can go into the road, into the pavement. There are signaling systems, there are signs, interactive, and all of these kind of things. And so the Starling system is really designed to manage all of those. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is this idea of kind of connecting people together so that they can sort of take ownership or responsibility for something. And so the project I want to talk about is called Voiceover, which we worked on with several communities around Britain, starting in 2016 up in the north of England, in East Durham, which is it's actually old kind of former coal mining territory. And one of the things that emerged very early on while we were working with them, and we kind of worked in a very similar way to the way we had worked in Cinder, which was that we would talk about different things that the community saw in itself and what they might be looking for. And then we would kind of create prototypes over time to sort of try and explore these ideas and build it up into a bigger and bigger and bigger system. And one of the things that emerged quite early on was this idea of voice and having a voice both with each other, but also to the outside world, and being able to connect with neighbors who perhaps they didn't know. So people on their own street, where in the sort of 30, 40 years ago, people would say, oh, I used to know everyone who lived on my street, but now I don't know anyone. And so we started building a series of these systems where people could kind of use their voice to express something out in kind of physical space, basically converting their voice into this sort of light output. And what we ended up doing was basically connecting all of these together from house to house, and having discussions about how these these sort of installations would connect together, essentially to create a kind of a hyper-local social radio where everyone could talk to each other, and they could actually use this radio framework for whatever they determined it to be used for. In other words, they would kind of govern the system. So the way it works is that everyone who's part of the project has a radio, and it actually literally looks like a radio. It's the Voiceover radio, and this is connected to a kind of a light antenna on the outside of their house. And so when they speak to someone at the other end of the road, their message goes out of this light antenna, bounces down the road all the way to the other end, and it goes in and out of each house. So it's a very public kind of communication system. This is not about a private system. This is about saying what happens when there is a system that's actually explicitly created to be public and to share public information. I say public, but it's actually a closed system. So it's only for people who have joined the project. And participants could basically use this as an excuse to go to their neighbors and say, would you like to be part of the system? Actually, we need to be able to send a message around the corner. So, would you be part of this as well? Or people who weren't yet part of it would see these kind of flashing antennas and go and knock on someone's door and say, what's going on? Can you explain what's happening? So here's an example of it.
I know work in the in factory.
This is some...
One knock knock. Who's there? Chicken. Chicken who? Chicken pox.
So the system was really used for lots of different things. There were people using it to sort of tell each other about the old days. It was for young people to talk about their current situation. It was used, like you saw there, kids telling each other knock-knock jokes. Somebody actually used it to tell the neighborhood bedtime stories. And really, this was about the community kind of finding its own use for the system itself. We then did a different version. We used exactly the same kind of equipment, but we took it to a different community in London, which was a high-rise. And here it was slightly different because it was a very different context. And this building was actually largely filled with people who weren't even born in London. And so they had very different experiences that they were bringing to the project. And what was interesting was that people would talk about things like how they had actually admired their neighbors' cooking because they could smell it through the corridors, but they'd never actually met them. And so the Voiceover project really became a way for them to share their experience of what brought them to London and what they were doing at the moment in London, and then sharing those with each other. We also worked in Brighton a couple of years later. Actually, we worked with an artist called Emma Frankland, who's part of the trans and non-binary community. And she actually took the equipment over and created her own project with that. And it was all about having a set of performances and experiences through the system. We actually have no documentation of that because effectively it was her project, and it was only for the people who were participating in it. But there was one aspect which was public, which was at the Marlborough pub. We had this sort of installation on the outside of the pub where every time somebody was talking or contributing something to that network, the LEDs here would fill up and flash in response to the audio that was being contributed. So people could see that something was happening in the network, even if they weren't actually part of that network. So that brings me to the end. And I just want to recap about this idea of the infrastructures of participation. As I said at the beginning, you know, I'm kind of critical of the smart city paradigm, but I am kind of interested in this kind of engaging cities paradigm. And the reason that I talk about engaging cities is that actually that is a more useful metric, if you like, to track, which is how many people are actually engaged in and part of decision making in a city. And they fundamentally, for me, have to be built on this idea of infrastructure participation. The first being get more people involved in more decisions, even if they seem trivial or small. The more of those decisions, the better. The second is getting people to actually kind of experience a shared memory of a possible future, even if they haven't kind of explicitly created it. They are part of actually experiencing it in order to imagine what it might be used for in the future. And then the third is actually connecting people together so that they can do stuff together, achieve something together, leading to increased responsibility and impact. And with that, I say thank you for listening.
Thank you, Usman. Thank you for sharing your project with us. Yeah, I remember some of the project. You also showed new one that I didn't see in the lectures we did before, so it was extremely interesting. I forgot to mention before while we were, I was introducing you that I actually met Usman around 15 years ago in Florence, in an event called Festival of Architecture in Video. And Usman was already working on, so it was a festival dedicated to architects. I'm an architect too. Usman is trained as an architect too. So in that festival, I already discovered some of the directions and themes that Usman is now showing us. And it's incredible how they evolved. So thank you again.